worship you for me. You, Lord, you are worthy. No one can worship you for me. For all the things you've done for me, my worship. All of my worship. Receive my worship. All of my worship.
Good morning, Antioch, Waltham. I hope you had a special Thanksgiving, even in the midst of a global pandemic and rising number of cases. Hope everybody was well, was safe, and got to enjoy some time with family, even if it was over Zoom. Last Sunday, Richard finished off our Ephesians series by walking us through what it looks like to stand firm against the schemes of the enemy and to put on the full armor of God. This morning, I'm kicking off a new sermon series which will take us through the Advent season titled, The King is Here. What does it mean that the King is here? And who is this King? I believe these questions are worth exploring. During times of upheaval, uncertainty, turmoil, and doubt, we as a people need to know who our King is and what he brings to the fight. This morning, we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 9. And explore the prophetic announcement of Jesus, our King, coming to earth. This should be a familiar passage to many of us. Let's take a look at the prophet Isaiah's words in Isaiah 9, verses 1 through 7. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as a people rejoice at harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. It's important to understand the historical context of Isaiah's writing. Isaiah had the burden of proclaiming God's truth while his nation eroded before his eyes under the leadership of King Ahaz. Ahaz was the king of Judah who faced a grave national crisis. Judah was threatened in two ways. Internally, a moral, spiritual rot was corrupting God's people, and externally, the impending attack from multiple enemy armies was creating widespread panic among the people. Isaiah counseled King Ahaz to put his trust in the Lord and that the God of Israel would defend his people. With the grace of God and the wrath of God brought to bear upon the king's heart, you would think that this young king would run to him for refuge and lead his nation back from the brink. Instead, King Ahaz shoved God to the sidelines, trading his presence and power for an alliance with the pagan nation of Assyria. Well, as you can imagine, this doesn't go so well, and the wrath of God comes upon the nation of Judah. Chapter 8 of Isaiah's prophecy details just how this happened. It says, the shadows of a growing despair and deep gloom descend on Judah. King Ahaz and the majority of the people of Judah had departed from God, so God handed them over to their sin and to their enemies. It was a time of moral darkness, frustration, anger, and hopelessness under the judgment of God. But let me ask you a question. Is judgment God's only response to ungodliness and unrighteousness? When we mess up or turn our backs on God, is his only response to crush us. The resounding and repeated answer throughout the Bible is no. He woos us with his kindness. He makes a way to deal with our sin. He is a way maker that leads us back to him. Something happens to Isaiah between chapter 8 and chapter 9. Right in the midst of describing to the people of Judah what they can expect as a result of their rebellion against God, the Holy Spirit shifts time for Isaiah. Suddenly the prophet sees the future God will bring, and the contrast to the present gloom in Judah are fantastic and beautiful. Let's go back into our text and take a look. Starting in verse 2, instead of the darkness and doom of the present time in Judah, we hear Isaiah declare, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. A light has dawned on those living in the land of darkness." In verse 3, we read that instead of fears and tears in this struggling, a small nation, Isaiah thanks God, saying, "You have enlarged the nation and increased its joy. The people have rejoiced before you as they rejoice at harvest time, as they rejoice when dividing spoils." Instead of bondage, as hundreds of thousands are taken as prisoners of war by invading enemy forces, Isaiah describes in verse 4 a day, "For you have shattered the oppressive yoke and the rod on their shoulders, the staff of their oppressor, just as you did on the day of Midian," referring back to Gideon's defeat of King Midian. Instead of constant war, Isaiah sees the end of war. He says, "For the trampling boot of battle and the bloodied garments of war will be burned as fuel for the fire." This message is for us today. Light will come into your darkness. The fears and futility, the bondage and the guilt will be taken away. Joy in God will overtake those who once resisted and rebelled against God, and complete victory over every enemy will come for people who deserved the worst from a perfect and holy God. So who is this hero God? Who is this God who does for us what we cannot do for ourselves? And how will I know how to find him? Isaiah tells us. We read his description of the character of the Savior. He states, "For a child will be born for us, and a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, and Prince of Peace. The dominion will be vast, and its prosperity will never end. He will reign on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish and sustain it with justice and righteousness from now on and forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this." Many believe, as I do, that this description is the foreshadowing of the birth of Jesus some 700 years before he would come to earth. Isaiah chooses 4 titles to describe the character of this coming king. First, Isaiah describes him as a wonderful counselor. The word wonderful means marvelous, extraordinary, beyond the normal capacity to perform. In other words, the counsel of Jesus transcends human wisdom. He doesn't need or want my counsel or any others. He has a perfect plan for your life, and he knows exactly how to bring it to pass. If we will seek his counsel, he is standing by and ready to lead us. Romans 11:34 reminds us that his judgments and his ways are unsearchably deep. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? In any situation, in every challenge, he knows exactly what needs to be done. His plan of action is infallibly, wonderfully right. If you're looking for guidance in life, let me introduce you to a wonderful counselor. The next phrase that Isaiah used to describe this coming king is mighty God. This description of our coming King is so important. Jesus is fully God and yet humbled himself to take on the form of a man. This child possesses all the power of God. In a word, he is omnipotent, having unlimited power and able to do anything. This means there isn't a single situation that you can find yourself in which King Jesus cannot get you out of. He is a strong fortress, and he is mighty to save. If you tie this to the previous characteristic of Wonderful Counselor, it means that Jesus possesses the ability to carry out to the full all that his brilliant plans call for. That is why he is able to say, "My plan will take place, and I will do all my will," in Isaiah 46:10. In fact, this king is so powerful that he can absorb all the evil thrown at him until none is left to throw, and still defeat his enemy. Isaiah knew this mighty God and was able to say with confidence in chapter 57 that no weapon formed against you can prosper. The third description of this coming king is Everlasting Father. Some translate this title as Forever Father. Jesus will be a father to me in the best of ways. He will be loving, self-sacrificing, always looking out for my best. Psalm 103, verse 13 says that as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. Fatherly compassion from this king will never come to an end. He is my forever father. I had the pleasure of attending the virtual adoption ceremony of Stephen, now Josiah Fortier. As the judge proclaimed the adoption process official and complete, it was declared that Josiah was in his forever family. This is a beautiful picture of Jesus' love for us. He is both judge and father, and slams the gavel and declares to the entire universe, "You are mine. You have a forever father." When we put these three titles together, we see that the effective plans of my Wonderful Counselor will always have my best as the goal, and that the power to accomplish those plans will come to fruition, and that he will eternally be my forever father. The final description used for this coming king is Prince of Peace. This coming king is the only one who can bring peace between us and God through his blood. This peace is a lasting peace, a peace unlike the world's peace. It is from this place of peace with God, which we are called brothers and co-heirs with Christ. This peace through grace allows us, as prodigals, to come running home to the arms of a Father who rejoices over us. This peace allows us to live in troubled times and not be overcome. If the Prince of Peace lives in you, what can overwhelm you? It is no surprise to me that when the Prince of Peace found himself on a boat in the midst of a terrible storm, he was able to sleep in perfect peace. And upon his ascent from the bowels of the ship to stand in the fury of that storm, Jesus spoke peace to the wind and to the waves. He was able to speak out what he had in. Isaiah saw him coming, the one who would be God's answer for sinners like you and for me. He saw Jesus, the Wonderful Counselor. He came with wisdom and purpose and a perfect plan for you and for me. I encourage you this morning, follow him. As the mighty God, he will accomplish all his purposes. The devil threw everything he had at Jesus and couldn't stop God's plan of redemption. So this morning, I encourage you, hide behind him. As the everlasting Father, he loves us endlessly. Enjoy being in his presence. And as the Prince of Peace, he reconciles us while we were still his enemies and lives in us with his peace, speaking to every storm. Church, this morning, I give you the world's final and greatest King, the King to end all kings, whose kingdom and peace will never stop expanding. I give you the rescuer that we all need. I give you the leader that we all long for. I give you Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. The King is here.